The scream hung in the air like a physical thing, transforming the pleasant afternoon garden into something altogether different. For a moment, one crystalline, terrible moment, nobody moved. The conversations that had filled the garden ceased abruptly, and all faces turned toward the house where Edward's voice had originated. Then came the sound of footsteps, rapid and heavy, and Constance emerged from the French doors, her face drained of color, her composure shattered like dropped china. "Someone must telephone the police," she said, her voice oddly mechanical, as though she were reciting instructions from some manual of proper conduct in the face of catastrophe. "There has been an accident." In the study, Dr. James Hartley was across the lawn in seconds, his instincts as a physician overriding social convention. Christopher Pemberton followed close behind him, and several other men began moving toward the house. Miss Marple, however, remained seated in her wicker chair, her knitting bag still resting on her lap. She had learned long ago that the first impulse of most people in a crisis was to rush toward the problem, to do something, anything, regardless of whether their presence would prove helpful or merely add to the confusion. She sat quite still and observed. The garden party had collapsed entirely now. The neatly arranged groups had dissolved into anxious clusters, people speaking in urgent, hushed tones, speculation rising like steam. Within minutes, word had spread through the assembled guests with the efficiency of wildfire. Someone, though nobody seemed to know who exactly, had seen the body being carried out by the vicar and the doctor. A man, they said, someone from the village, but nobody seemed quite certain who. It was Rebecca Hart who provided the identification, her young face streaked with tears. She had been standing near the study window when the doors had burst open, and she had glimpsed the figure on the floor. It was Julian Ashworth, Edward's brother. He was quite dead. Miss Marple watched the reactions with the careful attention she brought to all human behavior. Margaret Pemberton's hands, already trembling, had begun to shake so violently that she could no longer hold her teacup. Her husband had placed a steadying arm around her shoulders, but his own face had taken on a peculiar expression, not shock precisely, but something more calculated, as though he were rapidly assessing the implications of this development. Edward Ashworth had been led back into the house by his mother, but not before Miss Marple caught sight of his face. It was wet with tears, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like relief, quickly suppressed and hidden away. The police arrived within 20 minutes, as they always did when summoned to Thornbury. Constable Graves came first, a competent young man who had been born and raised in the village and thus understood, implicitly, that every family here had secrets worth keeping. Behind him came Inspector Thornton, a thin, sharp-featured man from the county, who possessed all the confidence of someone accustomed to solving crimes through straightforward logical means. He was a good policeman, Miss Marple had always thought, but he lacked a certain understanding of the human heart. He believed in evidence, in facts, in the measurable and provable. He did not believe, as Miss Marple did, that the truth of a crime often lay not in what was done, but in why it was done, and why had everything to do with love, resentment, fear, and the quiet accumulation of small betrayals. The doctor emerged from the house and spoke quietly with the inspector. Miss Marple watched their exchange carefully. Hartley was, gesturing toward Edward, saying something about shock, about the need for the family to have privacy. Inspector Thornton was nodding, but his eyes remained sharp, already cataloguing the scene, the players, the possibilities. By 4 o'clock, the guests were being politely but firmly asked to depart. The garden party, that pinnacle of social accomplishment, had become a crime scene. As Miss Marple gathered her things and prepared to leave, she found herself standing near the rose garden where she had first settled. A coat button lay in the grass near the edge of the border, half hidden beneath the white clover that sprawled across the path. It was a good quality button, dark grey, the sort that might come from an expensive blazer. Miss Marple noticed it, bent slightly, and slipped it into her cardigan pocket with a movement so subtle that no one observing her would have seen anything unusual in her gesture. The walk from Clover Edge back to her cottage in the village proper took approximately 20 minutes. Miss Marple made the journey slowly, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the cobblestones, her mind working through the afternoon's events with the methodical precision she brought to all matters of interest. A man was dead, that much was certain, but the question of why he was dead, and more importantly, how his death had come to pass in Constance Ashworth's study in the middle of an afternoon garden party with 100 witnesses outside, that was a question far more complex than the police, with their fondness for obvious answers, would likely ask. Miss Marple's cottage stood at the far end of the village high street, a small stone dwelling with a garden that reflected her meticulous nature. Roses climbed the south wall, and herbs grew in neat rows near the kitchen door. She had lived there for nearly 30 years, ever since her husband's death, It had become the repository of all her knowledge of village life. Not knowledge gained through gossip precisely, though she was not naive enough to pretend that village gossip was without merit, but rather through the careful observation of human nature in all its manifestations. She set her walking stick in the umbrella stand and placed the coat button on the small table beside her reading chair. It was indeed a fine button, made of some composite material designed to simulate horn, with a subtle sheen that suggested expense. She retrieved her magnifying glass from the drawer. She had long ago learned that her eyes, while still reasonably sharp, benefited from such aids, and examined it more closely. There were tiny scratches on the surface, the kind that might result from careless handling or, perhaps, from being torn hastily from fabric. The telephone rang at precisely 5 o'clock. It was her dear friend, Mrs. Dorothy Bannister, who lived in the neighboring cottage and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear just when one might benefit from conversation. Dorothy had not attended the garden party. She was recovering from a minor cold, and was therefore eager for a full accounting of the afternoon's dramatic events. "It's Julian Ashworth, you know," Dorothy said without preamble. "The solicitor's wife mentioned it when she was collecting the eggs from my hens. Apparently he was struck over the head with something from Constance's desk. A paperweight, they're saying, though that might be village speculation. You know how people do exaggerate." Miss Marple made a small noise that could have been agreement or merely acknowledgement, and allowed Dorothy to continue. This was the proper way of extracting information from one's neighbors. Listen more than one spoke, ask very little, allow the other person's natural inclination to fill silence to do the war. "K for you. Edward found him, apparently," Dorothy went on. "Poor man was quite distraught. Though between you and me, Jane, Edward and Julian were never particularly close. There was some scandal years ago, something about a woman, though nobody seems to remember the details anymore. Constance certainly never spoke of it." After Dorothy had exhausted her supply of information, or at least the portions she was willing to share in the first conversation, Miss Marple thanked her warmly and promised to visit the following afternoon for tea. She then settled into a chair with a pot of Earl Grey and allowed her mind to work through what she had observed. A man struck over the head. That suggested crime of passion, or at least one committed in the heat of anger rather than with premeditation. Yet the circumstances suggested something far more calculated. Julian had been lured into the study, or had gone there of his own volition. The study was not a room one simply stumbled into during a garden party. Someone had known he would be there. Someone had ensured that they would also be present in the house at that precise moment. The murder had been committed in the middle of an afternoon gathering where escape would be difficult and discovery almost inevitable. That suggested either profound desperation or considerable confidence in one's ability to avoid suspicion. She thought of Edward's face when she had glimpsed it that afternoon. The tears were genuine. She was quite certain of that. But relief? That was more interesting. Relief suggested that some burden had been lifted, some problem resolved. What problem might Julian Ashworth's death resolve? That was a question worth pursuing. Then there was the button. It had been near the rose garden, near the path that led from the French doors of the study to the exterior of the house. It had not been lying casually, as a button may. H.T. fall if one were simply careless about one's appearance. It had been positioned deliberately, half hidden beneath the clover, as though someone had dropped it and then made a cursory attempt to conceal it without fully succeeding. But here was where the matter became truly interesting. Miss Marple had observed the assembled guests with considerable care. She had noticed their clothing, their comportment, the small details that often betrayed far more than people realized. Edward's blazer was dark blue, not grey. Christopher Pemberton had been wearing a charcoal suit, but both of his buttons had been intact. She had observed this when he followed the doctor toward the house. The vicar wore his customary black coat. The other men of the village, the farmers and shopkeepers, wore various combinations of clothing, but none that appeared to have recently lost a button, which left the women, or perhaps someone who had since changed their clothing, or perhaps someone who had simply been careful enough to conceal the damage to their garment. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose from her chair with the careful deliberation that age required. She placed the button back in her cardigan pocket and looked out the window at the darkening village. By now, Inspector Thornton would have examined Julian Ashworth's body. He would have noted the wound, asked his preliminary questions, begun the process of narrowing his suspects according to the logical rules that governed police investigations. He would, no doubt, be very thorough. But thorough and correct were not always the same thing. And in matters of murder, Miss Marple had learned, the most important truth was often hidden not in the evidence, but in the human heart. The morning after Julian Ashworth's death dawned grey and damp, the sort of English weather that seemed appropriate for a murder investigation. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind occupied with the particulars of the case, and she had risen early to tend her garden before the day's heat might arrive. She was deadheading the roses when Constable Graves appeared at her garden gate, looking uncomfortable in the way that young men in uniform often did when they were about to ask for assistance. They were not entirely certain they had the authority to request. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his helmet respectfully. "Inspector Thornton wondered if you might have a moment. He's interviewed most of the village, but he thought perhaps you might have observed something at the party that others missed, being, as he put it, a woman of considerable perception." Miss Marple smiled at this description. Inspector Thornton was being diplomatic, which suggested he was either uncertain of his direction or was beginning to realize that the obvious answers might not be the correct ones. She set down her pruning shears, removed her gardening gloves, and invited the constable to wait while she changed into her outdoor shoes. The police had established themselves in the village hall, a modest stone building that served multiple purposes depending on the week's requirements. Inspector Thornton sat at a folding table, surrounded by notebooks and a cup of tea that appeared to have grown cold some hours earlier. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the kind of face that suggested a lifetime of skepticism tempered only slightly by professional courtesy. "Miss Marple," he said, rising as she entered. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate the inconvenience." "Not inconvenient at all," she replied, settling herself in the chair he indicated. "I find that one's observations are often clearer when one discusses them with someone taking an objective view." The inspector leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that suggested he was deciding how much trust to place in her assessment. "The preliminary examination suggests that Mr. Julian Ashworth was struck over the head with a decorative paperweight from Mrs. Ashworth's study desk. The blow was delivered with considerable force, almost certainly from behind. Death would have been relatively swift, though not instantaneous." "And the time of death?" Miss Marple inquired. "The doctor estimates between 3:20 and 3:40, based on body temperature and rigor mortis." Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, depending on one's perspective, there were approximately 100 witnesses who were outdoors during the relevant time period, which rather narrows the field. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet someone managed to enter the study, commit the murder, and exit without drawing undue attention. That suggests either exceptional luck or considerable planning." "Precisely my thinking," Thornton said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Now, at the garden party yesterday, you were seated near the rose garden for a portion of the afternoon. Did you observe anything unusual? Any of the guests entering or leaving the house? Any conversations that seemed significant?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. She could have mentioned the button immediately. A more direct witness might have done so. But direct testimony about physical evidence was the province of the police. What Miss Marple could offer was something far more valuable. An understanding of motive, of character, of the small behavioral details that revealed what people were truly thinking beneath their social masks. "I observed that Edward Ashworth seemed somewhat preoccupied," she said. "He was speaking with Mr. Pemberton, but his mind did not seem to be entirely present in the conversation. And then, quite abruptly, he excused himself and walked toward the house. His pace suggested urgency wrath, ear than casual movement. Why would he be going to the study?" Thornton asked. "I couldn't say," Miss Marple replied, "but it was approximately 15 minutes before his scream alerted the other guests. During that time, I noticed that the conversation near the refreshment table had taken on a different quality. There was a tension that hadn't existed before. Tension among whom? Primarily among Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Pemberton appeared quite anxious, and her husband had adopted what I might describe as a protective posture, though perhaps that is reading too much into body language." The inspector made a note. "The Pembertons have been together for how long?" 8 years married. "Mr. Pemberton's first wife passed away approximately 10 years prior. They married rather quickly after her death, though I suppose people do grieve differently." Thornton frowned, tapping his pen against his notebook. "Pemberton has rather a lot to lose if there were any scandal. His reputation is essential to his practice." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "The solicitor's position in a village is rather dependent upon the trust of the community. Any hint of impropriety could be quite damaging." "Was there impropriety?" Thornton asked directly. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Inspector, I am not in the business of confirming rumors or speculating about matters that are not my direct concern. I can only tell you what I observed, that Mrs. Pemberton appeared distressed, and that her distress seemed to increase when Mr. Julian Ashworth was in her vicinity." This statement seemed to strike the inspector as significant. He leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening. "You suggest there was some prior acquaintance between them?" "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "I merely report what I observed." Mrs. Pemberton did look at Mr. Ashworth with an expression that was not on of simple social courtesy. Whether that was due to previous acquaintance or for some other reason entirely is a matter for you to determine. As Miss Marple rose to leave some 20 minutes later, having answered several additional questions with the careful precision she brought to all such matters, she reflected on how much she had not told the inspector. She had not mentioned the button, had not discussed Edward's expression, had not offered her observations about the particular qualities of desperation versus calculation. Those details would emerge when the time was right, and not before. For now, she had provided enough to guide the investigation in a particular direction, while maintaining the appearance of simple village observation. The game, as they say, was afoot. By that evening, the village had transformed itself into something resembling a Greek chorus, each household a node in the vast network of speculation and rumor that seemed to operate independently of any factual foundation. Miss Marple heard the various theories when she attended evening service at St. Michael's Church, a habit she had maintained for nearly 50 years, and she listened to them all with the same patient attention she brought to all human discourse. Edward had murdered his brother out of jealousy over some inheritance, one theory suggested. Julian had been involved with a married woman, another version proposed, and the wronged husband had taken matters into his own hands. There was even a rather creative suggestion that Julian had been a blackmailer, extracting money from various village residents through threats of revealing their secrets, and had finally pushed someone too far. What was notable, Miss Marple reflected as she walked home from the church, was that none of these theories seemed to adequately address the question of how the murder had been committed. In a village of 100 people gathered in a garden, with only one house containing the victim and his killer, the perpetrator would have needed either remarkable luck or intimate knowledge of the timing involved. That suggested premeditation, which in turn suggested that whoever had killed Julian Ashworth had known with some certainty that he would be in that study at that particular moment. She was lost in these reflections when she encountered Margaret Pemberton near the post office. Margaret appeared even more anxious than she had at the garden party, if such a thing were possible. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched her handbag as though it might contain something precious and fragile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm so glad I've seen you. I wondered if perhaps we might speak privately, somewhere away from the village." This was precisely the sort of development that Miss Marple had anticipated, and yet her expression betrayed nothing but sympathetic concern. "Of course, dear. Would you care to walk back to my cottage? It's not far, and we could have a cup of tea." Margaret glanced around nervously, as though concerned that even this brief conversation might be observed, and then nodded. They walked in silence along the high street, and it was only once they were safely enclosed within Miss Marple's sitting room, with the door firmly closed, that Margaret began to speak. "I didn't know he was coming back," she said without preamble. "I didn't know Julian was returning to the village. Christopher hadn't told me, or perhaps he didn't know either, but when I saw him at the party, I felt quite ill. I thought I might faint." Miss Marple poured 2 cups of tea from the pot she had prepared and handed one to Margaret, who accepted it with shaking hands. "How long has it been since you last saw Mr. Ashworth?" she asked gently. 8 years, Ma," Garrett whispered. "Nearly exactly 8 years. It was before I married Christopher. I was engaged to Julian, you see. We were to be married in the spring, but then his family opposed the match. His mother particularly. She said I was not suitable, that Julian could do better, that he was throwing away his prospects on a girl from a modest background." Margaret's voice became bitter. "So Julian simply left. He went abroad without explanation, without even a proper goodbye. He sent a letter through his solicitor saying he had decided not to go through with the marriage, and that was that." "And then you married Christopher Pemberton," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Not immediately. I was heartbroken for quite some time, but Christopher was kind, and he was persistent, and eventually I came to care for him. He knew about Julian, of course. I told him before we married. He said he didn't mind, that what mattered was that I was with him now." Miss Marple regarded her visitor with the sort of thoughtful expression that had over many years encouraged people to tell her things they might not have intended to reveal. "But something has changed," she suggested. "Something has made you anxious since you learned of Mr. Ashworth's return." Margaret set down her teacup with such force the tea sloshed over the rim. "Julian came to see me," she confessed. "He came to the cottage while Christopher was at his office. He said he had made a terrible mistake, that he had never stopped thinking about me, that coming back to the village was about seeing me again. He said he wanted us to leave together, to start over somewhere else. He was very insistent, very passionate about it." "And what did you tell him?" Miss Marple asked. "I told him it was impossible. I told him I was happy with Christopher, that the past was the past. But he didn't believe me. He said he could see that I wasn't truly happy, that I was simply settling because I was afraid to risk my heart again." Margaret's voice broke slightly. "And the terrible thing is, Miss Marple, he was right. I'm not happy with Christopher. I haven't been happy for some time, but I have become comfortable, and comfort is not something I'm willing to throw away for the possibility of pain." Miss Marple listened to this confession with her hands folded in her lap, her expression remaining neutral and compassionate. She was aware, even as Margaret spoke, that this was a revelation that answered certain questions while raising others far more troubling. "Did your husband know about this visit?" Miss Marple asked carefully. Margaret's face paled. "I don't know. I don't think so. But Christopher is very clever, Miss Marple. He has ways of finding out things. And if he knew that Julian had come back, that he was trying to take me away—" She trailed off, the implications hanging unspoken between them. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at her garden where the roses glowed softly in the fading light. Christopher Pemberton, respectable solicitor, had certainly had motive. But did he have opportunity? That was the question that now required answering. After Margaret had left, fortified by tea and the vague reassurance that her confidence would remain private, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room and allowed her mind to work through the implications of what she had learned. The button remained in her cardigan pocket, and now it seemed to take on new significance. Christopher Pemberton wore expensive clothing. She had observed his wardrobe over the years, noted the quality of his tailoring. A button from his blazer would indeed be grey, the color of the button she had found. But here was where the matter became complicated. If Christopher had committed the murder, how had he managed to be in the study at precisely the right moment? The garden party had been a social occasion, and a solicitor of Christopher's standing would have been expected to remain among the guests, visible, accounted for. To slip away, commit a murder, and return without being noticed required either exceptional luck or careful planning. Miss Marple retrieved her notebook. She had kept such a record for many years, a habit that occasionally proved useful, and began to organize what she knew. The timeline was crucial. Edward had left the garden at approximately 3 to 15. Julian had been found dead sometime shortly after 3:30. That meant the murder had occurred in that narrow 15-minute window. During that time, who had been unaccounted for? Who had the opportunity to be in the house? She was still pondering this when the telephone rang at 9 o'clock that evening. It was Inspector Thornton, his voice carrying the particular tension of a man who had encountered an unexpected complication. "Miss Marple, I apologize for the late hour, but I thought you should know that we've made an arrest. Christopher Pemberton has been taken into custody for questioning regarding the murder of Julian Ashworth." "On what grounds?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We found evidence that suggests a prior connection between Mr. Pemberton and the victim. Apparently, they knew each other years ago, before the victim left the village. More significantly, we've discovered that Mr. Pemberton stood to benefit from Mr. Ashworth's death through certain financial arrangements. The victim had recently returned to the village and made inquiries about renewing his relationship with Mrs. Pemberton, which would have posed a threat to Mr. Pemberton's marriage and, by extension, his social position." "I see," Miss Marple said, thoughtful. "Lie. And what does Mr. Pemberton say about his whereabouts during the garden party?" There was a slight hesitation before Thornton replied. "He claims he was in the garden the entire time, speaking with various guests. However, we have identified a window of approximately 10 minutes, during which no one can specifically account for his presence. It would have been sufficient time to slip into the house, commit the murder, and return to the garden without drawing significant attention." 10 minutes, Miss Marple repeated. "That is a narrow window indeed." "Narrow, but not impossible," Thornton said. "We're quite confident we have our man. The motive is clear, the opportunity exists, and his behavior since the murder has been suspicious. He's refused to answer several questions directly, and has been attempting to contact various individuals who might corroborate an alibi that he has not yet been willing to articulate." After the inspector had ended the call, Miss Marple sat in silence for a considerable time. She believed in facts, in evidence, in the careful observation of human behavior. She also believed in her own instincts, developed over a lifetime of village observation, and her instincts were telling her that while Christopher Pemberton certainly had motive, and perhaps opportunity, something about this solution did not align with what she had observed. She thought of Edward's expression when he had emerged from the house, the particular quality of that relief combined with grief. She thought of Constance Ashworth, standing in the French doorway, her composure shattered in a way that suggested genuine shock rather than performance. She thought of the button, half hidden beneath the clover, positioned in a location that suggested someone had dropped it while making a hasty exit from the study. The next morning, Miss Marple dressed carefully and made her way to T, a police station in the neighboring market town. Inspector Thornton received her with the sort of courtesy one extends to someone whose opinion one has come to respect, though he seemed slightly bewildered by her unexpected visit. "Miss Marple, this is an unexpected pleasure. Has something occurred to you regarding the case?" "I wonder if I might see the paperweight," she said without preamble. "The object used to commit the murder, I mean. And I should also like to know precisely where Mr. Ashworth's body was positioned when it was discovered." Thornton exchanged a glance with Constable Graves, then gestured for her to follow him to the evidence room. The paperweight was a substantial object, made of marble with a bronze base, the sort of thing one might find on a professional's desk. She examined it carefully, noting the bloodstains, the angle of the damage, and the body's position. She asked. Slumped backward in the desk chair, Thornton replied. He had apparently been sitting at the desk when he was struck from behind. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the scene. Someone had come up behind Julian while he sat at Constance's desk. The paperweight had been within reach. It would have been sitting on the desk itself. The attacker had seized it and struck downward with considerable force. It was a crime of passion, yes, but also of opportunity. Someone had known Julian would be at that desk, at that precise moment. "Inspector," she said slowly, "I should like very much to know why Mr. Ashworth was in the study at all. Was he summoned? Did someone ask him to go there? Or did he go of his own volition?" Thornton frowned. "We haven't yet determined that. Mr. Pemberton claims he didn't arrange any meeting, and there's no evidence to suggest otherwise." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "you might consider who else had reason to speak with. Mr. Ashworth in private, away from the garden party." Inspector Thornton's expression shifted from confident certainty to something approaching doubt. He dismissed Constable Graves and led Miss Marple to his office, where he poured 2 cups of rather poor quality tea from a pot that had clearly been sitting for some hours. "You're suggesting that we've arrested the wrong man," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that motive and opportunity alone do not necessarily identify the guilty party. Mr. Pemberton certainly had reason to wish Mr. Ashworth harm, but someone else had reason to ensure that they were removed from scrutiny, and that someone else knew precisely how to accomplish it. You'll have to be more direct than that, Miss Marple." She set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me, Inspector, who discovered the body? Who was the first to enter the study after the murder was committed?" "Edward Ashworth," Thornton said slowly. "He was the one who screamed. He found his brother slumped in the chair. And what was Edward doing in the house at that particular time? Was he summoned? Did someone ask him to fetch something?" Thornton consulted his notes. He said he had gone inside to use the lavatory. He was passing the study when he noticed the door was slightly ajar and the lights were on. He looked in to see if anyone was there. He thought perhaps his mother had gone to rest and found his brother dead. "How convenient," Miss Marple said softly. "Edward goes to use the lavatory, happens to pass the study, happens to glance inside, and he is the one to make the discovery. He is therefore the first person to know that Julian is dead. He is the one to raise the alarm, to ensure that all the guests come running." "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Inspector. I'm simply observing that Edward's position as the discoverer of the body gives him considerable control over the narrative. He is the one whose grief seems most natural, most genuine. He is the one who is least suspected because he is the one who appeared most upset." Thornton leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed intensity. "You're suggesting that Edward Ashworth murdered his own brother?" "I'm suggesting that you should examine more carefully the question of who summoned Julian to that study, and who knew he would be there, because someone did summon him. A man does not simply sit at his mother's desk in the middle of a garden party without reason. Someone must have asked him to go there, promised him something, or threatened him with something." The inspector rose and began to pace. "We've found no note, no message. We've questioned the household staff, and no one recalls anyone sending for him. A message need not be written," Miss Marple observed. A word spoken quietly, a gesture made across a crowded garden, a promise whispered during a moment of apparent social conversation. There are many ways to communicate privately, even in a crowd. Thornton stopped pacing. But what motive would Edward have? Julian is his brother. Presumably they shared an inheritance. "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "Now you're beginning to ask the right questions. What was the nature of their relationship? Was it truly as casual as it appeared? And most importantly, what had changed recently to make Edward feel that his brother's presence in the village was an intolerable threat?" Over the next hour, Miss Marple guided the inspector through a careful reconsideration of the facts. She spoke of the relief she had observed in Edward's face, the way his grief had seemed almost performative in its intensity. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had observed Edward, speaking with various guests both before and after the murder, and that he had seemed quite concerned with establishing exactly where everyone had been at the crucial moment. "He was managing the narrative," Thornton said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "He was creating confusion about timing and alibis. He was doing what any intelligent person would do if they had committed a crime in front of 100 witnesses, Miss Marple agreed. He was ensuring that the investigation would focus on motive and opportunity, both of which he could see were abundantly present in others. Mr. Pemberton's jealousy was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Edward simply needed to ensure that the police would reach the same conclusion. Thornton picked up his telephone and spoke briefly with Constable Graves. Within minutes, Edward Ashworth was being brought in from the cells where he had been kept pending his mother's lawyer's arrival. He looked confused rather than frightened, his composure intact in the way that came from knowing one had carefully prepared for this possibility. "Edward," Thornton said, his voice now carrying the weight of authority that came from finally understanding the truth, "I want you to tell me about your brother's return to the village. I want to know what conversations you had with him between his arrival and the garden party. And I want to know why you felt his presence here was something that needed to be addressed with violence." Edward's composure cracked slightly. His jaw tightened, and for just a moment, that same relief Miss Marple had observed appeared in his expression. It was as though the burden of maintaining the lie had become suddenly too heavy to bear. "He was going to ruin everything," Edward said quietly. "The inheritance, the business, the family name. He said he was going to contest Father's will, claim that he had been unfairly excluded. He said he had evidence that Mother had coerced Father into changing the documents. He was going to tear the family apart. So you asked him to meet you in the study," Miss Marple said gently. "You told him something that made him curious enough to slip away from the garden party and go inside." Edward nodded slowly, and the confession that followed was, in its way, almost a relief. The unburdening of a man who had carried the weight of murder for too long beneath the mask of a grieving brother. The confession came in measured tones, as though Edward were describing someone else's actions rather than his own. He had told Julian that their mother wished to speak with him privately, that she had asked Edward to fetch him from the garden. It was a simple lie, the sort that required no elaborate preparation, merely the knowledge that Julian would respond to such a summons. After all, Julian had been attempting to reintegrate himself into the family structure, to heal the rifts that his 8-year absence had created. "I thought he would listen to reason," Edward said, his voice hollow. "I thought I could convince him to leave again, to go back abroad and resume his life there. I offered him money. I told him I would arrange for substantial payments if he would simply disappear and never contact any of us again. But he refused," Thornton prompted. "He laughed," Edward said, and in that single word was contained years of accumulated resentment. "He actually laughed at me. He said that no amount of money could compensate him for what he had lost, for the years he had spent abroad, believing himself cast out by the family. He said Mother owed him an apology, that Father's will was unjust, and that he intended to pursue the matter through every legal avenue available. He said he wanted to destroy her, to strip away the respectability and social standing she had spent her entire life cultivating." Miss Marple, who had been observing Edward's face as he spoke, noted the particular intensity with which he described this moment. It was not mere anger that had driven him to violence. It was the collision of two forms of desperation, Julian's need for vindication and Edward's desperate need to preserve the ordered world that had been handed to him at birth. "The paperweight was within arm's reach," Edward continued, his voice becoming almost mechanical. "He was sitting at Mother's desk, and he had his back to me. I had walked behind him while he was reading the letter I had left on the desk, the one offering him the money. He was reading it, and I could see in his face that he was unmoved, that nothing I could offer would dissuade him. And I simply acted. There was no thought, no deliberation. I picked up the paperweight and struck. And then?" Thornton asked. "And then I screamed," Edward said. "I screamed because I had to be the one to discover him. I had to be the one to make the discovery public, to control how the information spread. I walked out into the garden. I screamed, and I waited for everyone to come running." Inspector Thornton rose from his chair and placed his hand on Edward's shoulder. "You're under arrest for the murder of Julian Ashworth," he said, reciting the formal caution with the weariness of a man who had done this many times before. As constables led Edward away, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. Inspector Thornton returned to his desk and looked at her with an expression that mingled gratitude with something approaching embarrassment. "I was convinced it was Pemberton," he said. "The motive was so clear, the jealousy so obvious. I was looking for what I expected to find rather than what was actually there." "That is a common mistake," Miss Marple said general. "Cly, we all tend to see what we anticipate seeing. It requires considerable discipline to observe without preconception." "How did you know?" Thornton asked. "What was it that made you certain it was Edward rather than Pemberton?" Miss Marple considered this for a moment before responding. "Several things, actually, though none of them were particularly definitive on their own. First, there was the question of Julian's position when he was found. He was sitting in a desk chair, which suggested he was waiting for something or reading something or engaged in some activity that required him to be seated. A man does not sit at another's desk in the middle of a social gathering unless he has been specifically invited to do so. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the market town beyond. Second, there was Edward's expression when I observed him that afternoon. It contained relief, which is unusual in a man who has just discovered his brother dead. Grief, certainly. Shock, undoubtedly. But relief suggests that the discovery itself was not surprising, that Edward had anticipated finding exactly what he found. "And the button?" Thornton asked. "You never mentioned it. The button was a grey button, the sort that might come from Mr. Pemberton's clothing. It was positioned beneath the clover near the French doors of the study, as though it had been dropped during a hasty exit. It seemed designed, in fact, to suggest that someone had hurried from the study to the garden. Mr. Pemberton would have known about the button, would have realized he had lost it. Yet he never mentioned it, never attempted to explain its presence. A guilty man would have been far more likely to offer an explanation." "You used it as a misdirection," Thornton said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I allowed you to draw your own conclusions," Miss Marple corrected gently. "The button W, as indeed a clue, but not in the way that it appeared. It was evidence that someone had been careless, yes, but carelessness in concealing evidence is not the same as carelessness in committing a crime. Edward was very careful in his planning. He knew precisely what he was doing when he asked Julian to meet him in the study. He knew that Pemberton's jealousy would provide the perfect distraction for the investigation. They walked together toward the police station's exit, where Miss Marple's car was waiting to return her to Thornbury. As she prepared to leave, Thornton asked one final question. "Will you speak with Mrs. Pemberton? She should know that her husband is being released, that he has been exonerated of these charges." "I shall stop by the cottage on my way home," Miss Marple said. "I suspect she will need a sympathetic ear and a cup of tea, though I rather think her marriage has been damaged beyond repair by recent events. Sometimes the truth, while it may set us free, comes at a cost far higher than we anticipated." The drive back to Thornbury took nearly an hour, and Miss Marple spent the journey in quiet reflection. The case was solved, the guilty party identified and in custody, yet she found herself preoccupied with the aftermath, with the manner in which a single act of violence rippled outward through the delicate social fabric of a small village. Edward Ashworth would face trial, would likely spend many years in prison contemplating the moment when he had allowed desperation to override reason. Julian would remain dead, his attempt at reconciliation with his family resulting only in tragedy, and the village itself would carry the scar of this knowledge forever. She asked her driver to stop at the Pemberton cottage, a modest but well-maintained house on the outskirts of the village. Margaret answered the door, looking considerably worse than she had. The previous evening, her eyes were swollen from crying, and she was dressed in rumpled clothing that suggested she had spent the night in distress rather than rest. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I heard that the police released Christopher this morning. I don't know what to say. I feel as though I've destroyed everything." Miss Marple entered the cottage and found herself in a sitting room that, while pleasant enough, seemed to lack the warmth of a home where people were truly content. She settled herself in an armchair and gestured for Margaret to sit as well. "You have destroyed nothing," Miss Marple said firmly. "You were caught between two men, one of whom loved you and one of whom had loved you. There is no shame in that. The tragedy lies not in your situation but in the violence that Edward chose to employ, rather than accepting that not all relationships can be restored and not all wounds can be healed. Christopher won't even look at me, Margaret said. He knows that I felt something for Julian, that I would have left with him if circumstances had been different. He says he can forgive the feelings, but he cannot forgive the fact that I was dishonest about their depth. That may or may not be true, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Marriages have survived greater betrayals than this, though I grant you that trust, once fractured, is difficult to repair. However, what you and Christopher do with this knowledge is a matter for the two of you to decide. I am merely an observer of human nature, not a mender of broken hearts. They sat in silence for a time, and Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of truth and its consequences. She had guided Inspector Thornton toward the correct conclusion, had used her observational skills to identify the true murderer. But in doing so, she had also ensured that Margaret's affair, the nascent rekindling of her relationship with Julian, would become public knowledge, that Christopher's jealousy and insecurity would be exposed, that the illusion of their marriage would be shattered. Was this justice? Or was it merely the inevitable consequence of allowing truth to emerge into daylight? You should know something, Margaret said suddenly, as though reading Miss Marple's thoughts. About Julian, I mean. When he came to see me, when he told me he wanted us to leave together, he wasn't entirely honest either. He did want to reconcile with me, that was genuine. But his primary motivation for returning to the village was financial. He had lost almost everything abroad, bad investments, poor choices. He came back expecting to inherit a substantial portion of his father's estate. When he discovered that Edward had been left the bulk of the property and business, he became obsessed with contesting the will. Edward mentioned as much, Miss Marple said quietly. But what Edward didn't know, what I only discovered after speaking with Christopher, is that Julian's claim would have been entirely without merit. The will was properly drawn up, witnessed and legally sound. Julian could have contested it endlessly and would have lost. He was coming back for reconciliation and love, yes, but also out of financial desperation. He wanted to use his relationship with me as leverage, as a way to gain access to family resources. Miss Marple processed this information without visible reaction. It changed the nature of the crime somewhat, though not its essential truth. Edward had acted in panic and desperation, but his desperation had been born from a threat that, while serious, was not ultimately as devastating as he had believed it to be. People are rarely entirely good or entirely bad, Miss Marple said finally. Julian was capable of love, but he was also driven by need. Edward was capable of reasoned thought, but he was also capable of violence when he felt cornered. Christopher loved you, but he was also capable of jealousy. You loved Julian, but you were also drawn to the stability that Christopher represented. These are not contradictions, merely the complexities of human nature. When Miss Marple left the cottage an hour later, she had persuaded Margaret to give the marriage at least a few months before making any irreversible decisions. Whether that advice would prove wise or merely delay the inevitable, she could not say. The future was not her province. She concerned herself only with understanding the present and, when possible, illuminating the truth that lay beneath the surface of events. As she walked through the village toward her cottage, she found herself the object of considerable attention. Word had spread that Edward Ashworth was the murderer, that the police had arrested the wrong man initially, and that Miss Marple had somehow been instrumental in uncovering the truth. People she had known for decades greeted her with expressions of mingled gratitude and fear. Gratitude that the guilty had been identified, fear that this elderly woman who observed quietly from her garden chair possessed some almost supernatural ability to see into human hearts. She did not possess such ability. She merely paid attention. She observed patterns. She understood that people, when confronted with crisis, often revealed their true natures in the small choices they made. And having spent nearly a lifetime in Thornbury, she had accumulated enough knowledge of those patterns to occasionally guide others toward truths they might otherwise have missed. The village would recover from this tragedy, as villages always did. Life would continue. The gossiping and speculation would eventually fade, replaced by newer scandals and newer concerns. An Miss Marple would return to her garden, her knitting and her quiet observation of the eternal human drama that played out endlessly in this small corner of England. 3 weeks had passed since Edward Ashworth's arrest, and autumn had settled fully upon Thornbury. The leaves had turned to shades of burnt orange and deep crimson, and there was that particular quality of English autumn where the days grew shorter and the evenings arrived with an almost startling abruptness. Miss Marple had returned to her ordinary routines, her garden, her correspondence, her visits to church and the village shops. The excitement of the investigation had faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of daily life that characterized small villages everywhere. She was tending her roses on a particularly cold afternoon, when Constable Graves appeared at her garden gate with a letter bearing the official seal of the county courthouse. The trial date had been set for spring, some 5 months hence. Edward would remain in custody until then, his expensive solicitors preparing what Miss Marple suspected would be a defense based on temporary insanity, or at the very least diminished responsibility due to the emotional stress of his brother's return. That evening, Miss Marple attended a dinner party at the vicar's house. It was a small gathering, limited to the vicar's wife, the doctor and his second wife, and Miss Marple herself. The conversation was carefully steered away from the recent tragedy, but such avoidance only served to make the elephant in the room more conspicuous. Finally, as they were finishing the main course, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, could no longer maintain the polite silence. "Do you think he'll be convicted?" she asked, directing the question to Miss Marple as though she possessed some special insight into legal matters. "Edward, I mean. Do you think a jury will fin him guilty?" "I imagine they will," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "He has confessed to the act itself, after all. The only question remaining is whether they will view his actions as murder or as something less culpable. That will depend upon how effectively his lawyers can convince them that he was not entirely responsible for his actions at the moment he struck the blow." "Do you think he wasn't responsible?" the doctor's wife asked. She was a woman named Patricia who had replaced the doctor's first wife, and she had the particular eagerness to please that characterized those newly arrived in village society. "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Edward was entirely responsible for his actions, though not necessarily in the way a jury might interpret responsibility. He did not strike that blow in the grip of uncontrollable passion. He struck it in response to a calculated assessment of threat and consequence. That is a very different sort of action from one committed in the heat of the moment." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the nature of culpability. Edward had planned to speak with Julian. The spring assizes brought grey skies and persistent rain to the county town where the trial was to be held. Miss Marple attended on the opening day, dressed in her customary dark dress and pearl buttons, her knitting bag resting on her lap. She sat in the gallery reserved for spectators and observers, and she watched with the careful attention she brought to all matters of human significance. Edward Ashworth's defense was precisely what she had anticipated. His lawyers argued that he had not acted with premeditation, that his brother's return had triggered a psychological crisis, that the moment of violence had been the result of overwhelming stress rather than calculated malice. They presented expert testimony from a psychiatrist who suggested that Edward's rigid personality structure made him particularly vulnerable to what the doctor termed acute situational decompensation. The prosecution's case was straightforward and methodical. They established that Edward had lied about his reasons for summoning Julian to the study. They demonstrated that he had positioned himself to be the discoverer of the body, thereby controlling the initial narrative. They presented his confession, which, while damaging, was not as comprehensive as the prosecution might have wished. Edward's lawyers had instructed him to limit his admissions to the act itself without discussing his motivations or state of mind in detail. The judge was a woman of approximately 60 years, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to cutting through pretense and obfuscation. She listened to the testimony with an expression of polite skepticism, particularly when the defense's psychiatric expert began to explain how Edward's childhood experiences had shaped his personality in ways that made violence a potential response to crisis. On the third day of the trial, Miss Marple was called to testify. She made her way to the witness stand with the careful deliberation that age required, and she was sworn in with all the formality that the law demanded. The prosecution's barrister was a competent man named Richardson, who had prepared his questions carefully. "Miss Marple," he began, "you were present at the garden party on the day of the murder, were you not?" "I was," Miss Marple confirmed. "And did you observe anything unusual about Mr. Edward Ashworth's behavior that afternoon? I observed that he appeared preoccupied during his conversation with Mr. Pemberton, and that he excused himself rather abruptly to go to the house. His manner suggested urgency rather than casual movement. And after the body was discovered, what was your impression of his emotional state?" Miss Marple paused, considering the question carefully. "I observed a man who was experiencing genuine distress. However, I also observed an element of relief in his expression, which suggested that the discovery itself was not entirely unexpected." The defense's barrister, a silver-haired man named Ashton, approached the cross-examination with considerable skill. "Miss Marple, is it not true that relief might be a natural response to discovering one's brother dead? Relief that he was not in pain, for instance, or relief that the uncertainty was over?" "It is possible," Miss Marple acknowledged. "However, the quality of relief I observed seemed to relate to something more specific than simple humanitarian concern. And yet you cannot say with certainty what that something was." "I cannot," Miss Marple agreed. "I can only report what I observed." The trial continued for 2 more weeks. Additional witnesses testified about Edward's character, his financial situation, his relationship with his brother. Margaret Pemberton was called to testify about Julian's intentions regarding the will, and her testimony, while sympathetic, was ultimately damaging to the defense's argument that Edward had acted in genuine fear rather than calculated self-interest. On the morning of the verdict, the courtroom was packed with spectators. Miss Marple sat in her usual spot, her knitting in her lap, her hands working the needles with practiced efficiency. The jury returned after deliberating for 6 hours. They found Edward Ashworth guilty of murder, with a recommendation for mercy, a verdict that fell between the extremes of capital punishment and acquittal. As Edward was led from the courtroom, he caught sight of Miss Marple. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and she saw in his expression something that might have been gratitude. She had told the truth, had guided the investigation toward its conclusion, had ensured that responsibility was assigned where it belonged. But she had done so with a gentleness that acknowledged the complexity of human motivation, the way in which desperation and reason could collide in ways that produced tragedy. The judge sentenced Edward to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he be considered for parole after 20 years. It was, by the standards of the law, a merciful sentence. It acknowledged that, while Edward had committed murder, the circumstances surrounding that murder possessed certain mitigating elements. Miss Marple returned to Thornbury on the afternoon of the verdict. The village seemed unchanged by the trial's conclusion, as though the legal proceedings that had consumed so much time and attention were merely external events that did not truly touch the fundamental rhythm of village life. She was met at the station by Dorothy Bannister, who had brought her motor car. "Well," Dorothy said as they drove through the village, "justice has been served, I suppose. Though I must say, it all seems rather sad and wasteful. 2 brothers, a family destroyed, a village forever changed by what happened in one moment of violence." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "That is the tragedy of murder, I think. It is not merely the death of one person, but the destruction of an entire web of relationships and possibilities. The village will recover, as villages do, but we will remember, and that memory will shape how we understand human nature." She thought of Constance, who had already announced her intention to leave Thornbury and live with her sister in Cornwall. She thought of Christopher Pemberton, who had closed his legal practice and moved to another county to begin again. She thought of Margaret, who was attempting to rebuild her life. In the aftermath of betrayal and loss. And she thought of Julian and Edward, 2 brothers whose family tragedy had played out across the stage of a small English village. As evening settled over Thornbury, Miss Marple sat in her garden and contemplated the roses, which were beginning their spring bloom. The case was closed, the murderer identified and punished, the truth established beyond question. Yet she knew that truth, while essential, was not the same as understanding. Understanding required time, reflection, and the willingness to acknowledge that human beings were capable of both love and violence, of both reason and passion, often in the same moment. The village would move forward. So would she.